Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to the humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show. I'm quite excited for my guest today. I'm sure this is going to be an interesting and for many people a difficult conversation to have, but it has been requested many times that I take this on. So I wanted to reach out. Of course, I'm referring to, not that you should know unless you're like can read minds. I don't know why I assume that of my audience so often. But we're going to talk about abortion and how to think about abortion. This is a obviously very relevant and hot political topic. As you know, in the show, I really like to try to think seriously about things and find people out there who themselves have thought seriously about some of these deep, hard issues. So I reached out to Dr. Stephen, and you'll have to forgive me. How do you pronounce your last name? I didn't even ask you before the show.
Napier.
Dr. Stephen Napier, you are a professional philosopher, bioethicist. Your job is literally to think hard and long about these issues. So if anybody is eminently qualified to have this conversation, I figured it would be somebody like you. So thanks for taking the time to join me today, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So before we, kind of dive in here, why don't we just start with a little bit of background? How did you get to be doing the things that you're doing now? I know you're a professor at Villanova University. We've kind of been like 1 or 2 degrees of separation apart, so it's good to formally connect. But give us a little bit of your backstory, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I guess I got into philosophy basically through philosophy of religion. I was on campus as an undergrad, and converted to Christianity at that point, and kind of had nagging questions. Is this stuff true? Mm-hmm. This religious stuff, Christianity stuff, and so I really got into philosophy through my religious beliefs and wanting to see if they were really true or not, and really think about them philosophically.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm a convert to Catholicism, so I want to unpack this a little bit. I had no idea that was your story. Did you convert right to Catholicism, or what was that conversion experience like? I'm actually very curious to hear about that, especially since it happened in college, which is not always typical.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. My story is not typical, at least with respect to my religious beliefs. So, it was freshman year, college, and a friend of mine from high school who had attended the same university invited me to this. Back then, it was called Campus Crusade for Christ. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know what they were just putting on a concert. He just invited me to a concert, and I'd always been interested in philosophical stuff. And they had this little survey: "How interested are you in spiritual things?" And I put a 10 out of 10. Mm-hmm. Right, and next thing I know, they came by and they talked to me about the gospel, about Jesus. And at the time, I was just kind of a bare theist. I knew, or I had a belief that God exists, but it was more like the picture of the president on the wall. You kind of know the president exists, but you don't know. Yeah, you don't know anything about the president. And so they shared the gospel with me, and I kind of worked my way into it. And Campus Crusade is an evangelical Protestant organization, and grew a lot, sure. And then after I graduated, I went to grad school, and I actually came across an Orthodox professor. And that's when I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. And then I was Eastern Orthodox for about 3 years before I became Catholic.
Wow. So you kind of went through the, I don't even know how to describe it, but kind of I would say I'm sorry, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I kind of went all around. My next stop is Hinduism. So that's what I...
My friend Sam would appreciate that. One of my good friends.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, but I've been around the block, and so I mean, it's been great. It's been a great journey. Conversions are hard. Moral conversions, religious conversions. I understand that they're hard, but I do think that it's good to have a pliable mind to really resonate with, the best reasons out there. So that's one of the things that it's taught me.
So for you then so you converted to a sort of mere Christianity or evangelical in college. Was it then your continued study of philosophy that kind of brought you at least into Eastern Orthodox and eventually into the Catholic Church? What sort of fostered those decisions? Or was it a study of church history? Or take us through that a little bit. Not to digress too much on the main topic, but I'm curious.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I think that what really mediated the conversion from my initial evangelical commitments to Orthodoxy was a commitment to the historical church. And really, you mentioned philosophy, you're right, just a philosophical understanding of the sacraments. Mm-hmm. So that the sacraments, these material, physical things, can function as means by which God graces us, mm-hmm. and our gifts. And the principal sacrament was the Eucharist. I was really convinced that metaphysically speaking, this is the best way mm-hmm. that God can become indwelling in me. Yeah. I'm an embodied being, and for the saying that really resonated with me was a quotation from Saint Simeon the theologian. The end of the Christian life is to become by grace what Christ is by nature. Christ is fully human and fully divine. And that's the end of the Christian life, is to become by grace what Christ is by nature. And philosophically speaking, I was convinced that the sacraments are really the only, that are an essential, not the only, but the essential way by which that could be accomplished. And so that's what mediated the conversion to Orthodoxy. And then crossing the bridge over into Catholicism, that was more, I really don't think Orthodoxy and Catholicism, dogmatically, I don't think that there's a significant difference here. Of course, there will be people who really disagree with that.
There's like really subtle technical differences, like real presence versus real absence and stuff like that. But I'm with you. I get it, right?
Yeah,
it's not as diverse as Catholicism and Protestantism for the most part. Yeah.
Yeah. And I went to Orthodox seminary. I studied Orthodox theology. So when I look at the two traditions, I do think that ecumenical collaboration is possible at the dogmatic level. At the theological commitments are there. They're held in common, and so really the transition. I wouldn't say I converted, but I transitioned to Catholicism. More so because of there was a more pluralistic approach to prayer life, to spiritualities. You look at the monastic and religious traditions within Catholicism. There's different charisms, and It was just a more of a pluralistic place to grow and develop. And I found my home, my spiritual home, better in Catholicism than Orthodoxy. But I want to be clear. I don't disagree with what I learned and what I experienced as being an Orthodox.
Yeah, that's. I'm going to have you back on to talk more about that now. That just opened up a whole new can of topics for us. So prepare to be bothered by me through email again, Stephen. Okay, so now we have to do some stage setting, because obviously we're here to talk about how to think about abortion, and rightfully people would say, well, if he's coming from a Catholic perspective, he's probably pro-life. But the thing I would want to just flag right away is that to be pro-life does not mean that you have to be religious. In fact, in any sense, I have friends that are atheists and agnostics that are pro-life. They have no religious commitment. So I just want to flag that, because I know that's sometimes a misunderstanding people have. And in fact, I know you wanted to talk about, before we got into some of the technical details of the argument, just trying to get clear on what the pro-life position is and some common misunderstandings. So I'm going to give you some space. I'm going to step back here because I know that you're a professional on this and you probably know how to guide the conversation a lot better than I do. So why don't you just tell us where we should start?
Yeah, well, actually, dovetailing on your point about the plurality and, that the pro-life position is not necessarily religious. I mean, you want to, there's interesting number of organizations. There's actually at least 3 organizations out there devoted to pro-life feminism. There's pro-life feminists, there's feminists for nonviolent choices, and then there's New Wave feminism. These are all non-for-profit organizations supported by donations. There are actually 2 organizations devoted to atheists for life. So there's Secular for Life and Humanist for Life. There's Democrats for Life. There's even a Pro-Life Alliance of Gays and Lesbians.
Yep.
I mean, when you look at the pro-life movement, it's probably one of the most pluralistic moral movements in history. So it's very accommodating to a number of different political viewpoints. There's a book out called The Liberal Case for Pro-Life. I think it's the Liberal Case for the Pro-Life Position or something like that.
Yeah, and I'm really glad we're starting off on that note because I just want to, with conversations like these, I really want to be able to try and transcend common political divides and show. Obviously, I believe that this is an issue that no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, this is just such a reasonable thing to support that I wouldn't want. Because let's be quite frank, a lot of people assume their political positions because they have one thing they care very much about. They find the party that aligns with that, and then they just sort of assume everything else that party stands for. But I mean, at least initially, there doesn't seem to be much of a connection between, what you think the marginal tax rate should be and whether or not you think, late-term abortion should be permitted. I'm just not seeing the the necessary entailment there. So you see what I'm trying to say? Like, I want to try and get it like further out and higher up than these typical kind of party lines, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's surprising to me. I mentioned, my stepfather is inclined towards liberal political viewpoints. And we were talking about the Kennedy years and Kennedy and Johnson years. And it was just, I was always flummoxed that the liberal Democratic Party position became aligned with the pro-choice position because typically they had been in their policies always concerned about the poor and vulnerable. Yeah. And here you have the poor and vulnerable, right? The preborn children are in a vulnerable position. So I always flummoxed why the pro-life position became aligned with the political parties that it eventually did get aligned with. But I do think, just to get back, I mean, it doesn't matter what political party you're in. I think the philosophical position supporting the pro-life position seems to be very ecumenical and plausible, as you say. So maybe getting to that, that's a nice segue. I mean, the pro-life position all comes down to basically one claim: all human beings enjoy the right not to be intentionally killed. Right? To state that more positively, we all deserve a right to be loved from the moment that we exist. Yeah, that's really the pro-life position. And that stated as such, I mean, seems to be a very ecumenically attractive position. And this is another way to state it, and that's where maybe another way to motivate why somebody would think that. Saren Foster over at Feminists for Life, she mentioned to me one time, look, pro-life feminists are opposed to discrimination and violence, and abortion violates both. Right? Discriminates within the human family of who may be killed and who may not be killed. And abortion itself is a violent procedure. It sets out to end the life of a preborn human being. Yeah. So again, I mean, the moral commitments that are informing the pro-life position, the roots of that commitment, seem to be a very ecumenically attractive, it could be attractive to a pluralistic a number of different viewpoints,
and
political or religious. Yeah, go ahead.
And it is interesting because, and you're right, is at least when we hear, these arguments in the news or the mainstream media, and you would say even in academia, is it's not often presented like that. We often get these sort of crude caricatures about this as, trying to send women back to the dark ages or trying to control or like eliminate people's freedom. And so, let's go there before we get into some of the technical arguments. And I think we absolutely have to do that to show the philosophical coherency to this position. What are some of the common that you would say are misunderstandings or even tropes, if you want to go that far, about the pro-life position, and why are they wrong, and why should we move beyond them?
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned just in passing that in one misunderstanding might be that the pro-life position is only concerned about the preborn child and not the mother.
Mm-hmm.
That might be one misunderstanding. I mean, you mentioned it. That made me think of it when you mentioned, it's always aligned with women's rights,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so. But the pro-life position, a couple points on that is that no, everyone should be loved,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how is it pro woman that women have to choose between education or career and their child?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sound pro woman to me. If we're really pro woman, if we're really want to love the mother, then we're not going to force her to choose between education, career, and a child, right? Again, I keep on thinking through these things through Sarah Foster's work. From the moment of conception, the child has the same dignity or moral worth as everyone else, and again, that needs to be respected. And if that's the case, well, then also the dignity of the mother needs to be respected, right? And so it's a position, it being the pro-life view, is a position committed to equality.
Yeah.
Right? The equal respect of all people, right? And that if the mother thinks that the best option is that she needs to have an abortion to end the life of her preborn child, that's a symptom that something's gone wrong in her network of relationships, in the society at large. Something's gone wrong. We need to fix those problems.
Yeah.
Right? That seems to be a much more inclusive approach to solving that problem. It's a symptom,
yes,
of something having gone wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that the pro-life position is thoroughly pro-mother, mm-hmm. pro-woman, and that we need to think about better solutions. We need to think about how to care for and love all people in a much better way.
Yeah. And I completely agree. I think that the fact that we've just gotten to this debate around abortion right now is really the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. It is the result of many deeper and more fundamental societal and moral confusions, to just put it as charitably as I think I can possibly be about it. What originally intrigued me about this is in high school, I was very interested in libertarian philosophy. I would probably no longer call myself a libertarian because but libertarian for reasons I think we're about to talk about. But and some of the moral axioms didn't seem to be able to work themselves all the way through in libertarian thought. For example, what at first started to kind of turn me away from libertarianism, or a very strong form of libertarianism, and say figures like Murray Rothbard or whatever, is the sort of property rights as the highest right, or the absolute right. And I remember even Rothbard would be pro-choice because he said, well, it's in the woman's body, it's her property, and she has an absolute right over her body, so she can, she can abort. And that just seemed intuitively wrong to me. And in high school, I couldn't work at it at the time, but that got me really interested in moral philosophy because I really wanted to figure out why that seemed wrong to me or if he was right. Now, eventually that brought me to natural law theory, and natural law theory actually played a big part, traditional natural law theory, in my conversion to Catholicism, because I'm like, wow, the moral system here just is really good. Like this works all the way through. But it's funny because, even though most people statistically wouldn't consider themselves libertarians, it seems like a lot of the pro-choice position does take that claim. Well, it's a woman's body, therefore she has the right to do her body as she wants. Some people, even Murray Rothbard, use this language: is that that the fetus is a parasite, and no parasite has the right to just invade and live in somebody's body, so you can abort it. So I don't know if that's where we want to kick the conversation off, but I'm sure you probably have some. But that was my personal history with how to think about abortion. It started from a libertarian perspective, and it actually ultimately caused me to abandon a lot of my libertarian commitments over time because I didn't feel like this issue could be reconciled and made sense of from that particular philosophy. So I'll just kick it over to you for some thoughts on that now.
Yeah, no, that's great. There are actually quite a few features of libertarianism that I find attractive as well. But I mean, to that specific claim, the mother has bodily rights. But I mean, the mother has bodily rights, so does the preborn child, right? Because the preborn child has a body too. And it would be odd to not have bodily rights, even though you have a body. So I'd like to flip that argument on its head, right? So if the mother has bodily rights, so does the preborn child. And I mean, in terms of the embryology and the biology, I mean, it's clear you have a different body. It's not as if pregnant women have 4 arms and 4 legs,
2 hearts, and are mostly male if the baby's a boy, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's clear you have a different body. The fact that it's in the mother's body is actually that seems to be morally significant in the other direction, right? It's not as if it's an invader. It's now you've taken on the fact that it's in the mother's body. That's a beautiful thing, right? All human beings have had to go through their mothers, even if we came to exist through in vitro fertilization. We have all needed mothers to be where we are now, or to be the adults that we are now. And so that seems to be morally charged in the other direction, that there's a responsibility there to care for the vulnerable. And Stephanie Gray has a good book on this called Love Unleashes Life, where she tells various narratives and stories motivating this idea that, our moral commitments for caring for the vulnerable. She uses this example of, where you're hiking out in the woods and come up to a cabin and there's a baby that's been abandoned. Most of us would care for that child, at least bring the child back to the authorities and try to get it such that that child can be given the proper care. And the pro-life position is just that same moral sensitivity is just backed up, so to speak, in terms of the developmental timeline. Preborn children are just as vulnerable and also just as worthy of our love and care. Yeah. And so just because the preborn child is in the mother does not mean that it's permissible to kill the preborn child. And another way to think about this one last point on this whole bodily rights thing. So, having been a father, and the child is now no longer in my wife's body, but is now out there. That child is still in need of our behavior, right? So even though the child doesn't need my mother's in my wife's body anymore.
Yeah.
The child is still in need of our behavior to care for that child. And so we have no problem seeing that the post-born child does make demands on our behavior.
Yep.
It does involve our bodies being, our bodily behavior to care for that child, hug that child, carry that child around. So the idea that just because the preborn child is in the mother's body, therefore it's permissible to kill the preborn child, that doesn't follow, because or that's a very dangerous argument, because the key premise there would also justify withholding or being neglectful in caring for the postborn child.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because the postborn child is still making demands on our bodily behavior too.
Yeah, and I think in part of, and this is where I think we can show that the pro-life position should probably agitate anybody who's too deeply ingrained on the political ideological spectrum. So, I mean, take the libertarians or the very hardcore conservatives who would say that people only have negative rights. Obviously it's going to agitate people on the left who are just pro-choice by default, but it should even agitate people who only say that, we can only, acknowledge negative rights. There's no such thing as positive rights. But I would say there are positive rights, especially if in this type of argument where the child has a positive moral claim to be cared for and instructed by their parents, just as the parent has a positive moral claim to be obeyed by the children. That's just part of the essence of what it means to be human. And again, I think for people who want to dive deeper into this, natural law theory can be really helpful there. So I hate to say that I like the abortion argument, because obviously I don't like that we're having the abortion argument, but I think thinking deeply about it should force people to seriously and searchingly examine their moral foundations and entire worldview. Would you say that that's accurate, Stephen?
Yeah. I definitely think it's accurate. It does really challenge us. The pro-life view challenges us to love everyone, and that admittedly is hard. But I do think that it, as you say, I think that's right. It can agitate, but it should agitate.
Mm-hmm.
It does set a moral bar that is fairly high, but I mean, why shouldn't it? If I lived by a moral code in which I'm not challenged by that moral code, then that's not the right way. Groucho Marx said, I would never belong to a club that would have me.
Yes.
So that's kind of the same idea. I would never live by a moral code in which I would be comfortable with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really, that's a pretty low standard.
Yeah.
But just that last point on this, or last point I want to make on this point about, mothers and the idea of my body, my choice stuff. Don Requist recently argued that pregnant women are mothers to their preborn children, and since mothers are parents and parents have special duties of care towards their children, right? Mm-hmm. Then pregnant women have special duties to care for their preborn children. And he doesn't go on to say this, but I mean, even pro-choice philosophers that I've read will grant that, let's say a mother has an addiction, a drug addiction.
Yep.
And she's pregnant, and the child that, let's say she goes to term with the child, and the child is harmed by that drug addiction. Most of us would say that was irresponsible behavior.
Yeah.
Right? How we handle that, of course, we're compassionate, we're empathetic, and we try to treat people who have addictions. That's not the claim, but the claim is that most people will agree that was irresponsible, and that that addiction and that drug use harmed the preborn child.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we wouldn't have that intuition if we thought that if pregnant women did not have any moral responsibility, right?
It's really funny that you brought that up, because I actually had a conversation very much like this a couple months ago. I was talking to somebody who was pro-choice, and it was very ecumenical. I thought it was very productive, but almost immediately after we got off the topic of abortion, she talked about this roommate that she had that was doing exactly that, and she morally condemned it. So then, of course, I had to draw it back. I said, "Well, hold on, wait a minute."
Yeah,
there seems to be a deep inconsistency here. It's funny. Like, I literally had this experience, and you're right, because if we think that it's wrong to harm a baby in the womb with drinking or drug use or whatever, then how are we ever going to justify abortion on those grounds? It seems like there's some type of, if not an outright contradiction, at least a serious tension there philosophically. So, Stephen, let me ask you this, because the other thing coming back to property rights, and the thing that I think kind of really helped me or got me on this, and I would get your thoughts on that, is that, as an ethicist, is that, property by itself, at most, whether we're looking at it through natural law theory or even through like the lens of Locke or whoever else, seems at most to be only something that can ever have like instrumental value. That the fact that we even value property at all is because it seems like it might be necessary or helpful in the sense that it promotes human survival or flourishing. So it's something that has value in a derivative sense because it's attached to something that we consider intrinsically value, which is human life. So then it always seemed problematic to me that you could take this thing of instrumental value, which is a claim to the right to property, and somehow put it above that thing of intrinsic value, which is human life, or in this case, the fetus or the unborn. Because it seemed like doing that would just completely undermine the very foundation for why we even value property to begin with. Do you have any thoughts on that line of argument?
Yeah, and definitely I agree with all that. Property is not intrinsically valuable. And if nothing existed, no conscious being existed in the universe, but houses did,
yep.
Chairs did, desks did. There doesn't seem to be anything valuable about that. So houses are valuable because they provide shelter for us,
mm-hmm.
right? And so I agree that for most things that we would say are property or count as property do have merely instrumental value. That's not to say that they can't be significantly valuable. It's just that it's significantly valuable instrumentally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But even pro-choice people are not sympathetic, right? Marianne Warren, I mean, when her first article, or one of her first articles, her most famous article, she doesn't find much to be much warrant in this claim about property right. And she actually, there's a direct quotation, I have it up here. She says, "The appeal to the right to control one's body, which is generally construed as a property right, is at best a rather feeble argument for the permissibility of abortion. Mm-hmm. Mere ownership does not give me the right to kill innocent people whom I find on my property." Mm-hmm. Unquote. All right. So, I provide that quotation not to be pugnacious or anything like that, but that's if anyone is a pro-choice, a good exponent of the pro-choice position, it's Marianne Warren, and she doesn't find too much sympathy with that line of thought.
Yeah,
so I do think there's. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Continue. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it was just the idea here. They're really, philosophically speaking. I mean, yes, you're right. You hear in our culture, in the media, or whatever it might be, that there's this emphasis, or even in certain political thought traditions like libertarianism, that are plausible maybe on other things. That it's really not. That line of argumentation, namely bodily rights, is not, or property rights, I should say, is not well recognized as being a powerful argument at all.
So let's get into the sort of Well, I know, because I read both on the popular and technical level on this, and I understand that there's often a chasm of how the professional pro-choice philosophers will talk about this or argue about this versus what you'll typically see on memes on the internet. So I don't want to caricature it, but at the same time, I feel like both need to be addressed. If you understand what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, and I'm just trying to think of the kind of the best place to start. I guess at least on the popular level, and I know this isn't as prevalent in the academic level, but it's trying to, because most people would accept that starting premise of the pro-life position that every human being or every human person deserves to be loved. Where I think they'll try and jump out is denying that the fetus or the unborn is a human being. I don't know, go that far, but they usually deny personhood, right? So talk to us about that approach and how we should think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's correct to say that denying personhood to preborn human beings is exactly the route that academics typically take.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, academics take other positions as well, but so I think that is certainly a popular tactic, both in, as you point out, both in the academy and in the popular culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And granted, in the popular culture, it's stated differently, right? So one of my former coworkers, Father Tad Paholchik, was giving a lecture one time on embryonic stem cell research, and after his lecture, somebody held up a piece of paper and had like dots on the paper, and he said, the person in the crowd said, "Here, all we're doing is we're talking about dots, because that's probably the size of the embryo at the stage in his or her existence in which the stem cells would be extracted." And Father Tad's response was, "That's exactly what you look like at that stage in your development."
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so for personhood, most of the personhood objections will reference that they'll grant that that preborn human beings are in fact human beings. They'll grant that you and I are, grant that preborn human beings are human organisms, right? What they will deny is that those preborn children are identical to you and me. You and I did not come into existence until those organisms acquired the capacity for consciousness, sentience, self-consciousness. I mean, depends on the author. But some sort of psychological ability had to come on the scene, and that's when you and I came into existence.
Yeah,
right?
No, I'm sorry. Just continue. I'm just going to give you the space to develop this.
Yeah. So that's the first move, or that's the claim. And at least in the hands of Marianne Warren and some others, the argument for this claim is, well, when you think about what you are, a lot of what you're going to list are psychological abilities, right? The ability to communicate, the ability to think, the ability to feel. Those are going to be very important abilities that you have. And so this is an attractive position. I can understand why it's an attractive position to then say that, well, until those capacities or powers are able to be exercised immediately, until that happens, you do not exist. And different authors put the onset of those capacities at different points. Jeff McMahon, for example, puts it at between 21 and 28 weeks, or 24 and 28 weeks, or something like that, gestation. But that's the claim. That's the philosophical claim that you and I are human organisms that have the exercisable capacity for consciousness.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Okay. and that it either accumulates or manifests at some point in development, even though there's a wide diversity of opinion on when or what exactly brings that personhood about. Correct?
There's diversity in terms of when, but okay, good point. Right. Most authors will say, look, it definitely doesn't happen when most abortions occur.
Mm-hmm.
When most abortions occur. So David Boonin is pretty clear about this. He says the onset of these abilities usually takes place after 80% of abortions in the United States take place, because apparently most of them take place prior to the 12 weeks gestation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. And I do want to make sure that we're being as fair as we can in stating what the strongest forms of the academic positions are for the pro-choice. Because it's one thing to sit here and just kind of, smack down memes you'll see on the internet or talking heads on CNN. But I really want people to get a proper understanding of where this debate is on the technical level.
Yeah, that's I don't know how much more tech. I will say, just in fairness, I'll just mention, and then I can develop it if we have time. But so Marianne Warren basically appeals to our intuitions in terms of motivating why this should be considered true, right? So when you again list the properties that you think are important about you, the properties or abilities that you're going to list are going to be psychological ones, or ones that refer to your thinking ability.
Yep.
Other ways to motivate that are through brain transplant examples, and this is the principal methodology used by McMahon and some others.
Mm-hmm.
That gets a little bit more technical, so I'm going to have to.
Yeah, we can bracket that one, because I think there's other deeper philosophical issues and some kind of like smuggled in materialism that is unjustified with some of those examples. So. So, the claim is, intuitively we can understand why somebody would be attracted to this. Yes.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, you obviously don't agree with it. So what's the problem there?
Yeah. So I don't have I don't think it's plausible, because whereas it's true, right, that if I'm asked to think about, what is it that is important about being a person, you're right, or some of these authors are right, I would list psychological properties. But it doesn't follow from that I don't exist prior to the development of those properties. Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't follow that I don't exist prior to the development of those properties. And the confusion here is listing what would be important for for me being a person, what I would consider important, versus what I would list in terms of me being essentially a person.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Another way to state the problem here is Schwarz and Toselli point out that the procedure here fails to distinguish between functioning as a person and being a person.
Yeah.
Surgery patients under anesthesia can't immediately exercise the capacity for consciousness. Mm-hmm. Temporarily comatose patients cannot immediately exercise the capacity for consciousness. And you might say, well, they did possess the capacity for consciousness. But again, Schwarz and Toselli point out there doesn't seem to be a moral chasm between does not possess these capacities but will exercise them versus does not but did exercise these capacities. Again, put it more succinctly, does not but will exercise consciousness versus does not but did exercise consciousness. Mm-hmm. There doesn't seem to be a moral chasm between those two things that would justify killing one and providing extreme amount of protections for the other.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So I just, sorry to interject here, but I mean, the problem that always got me, and I really did try to, give the pro-choice position, I think, a really fair go, if no other reason than I kind of wanted libertarianism to work, especially in my high school days. There was a lot, there was a lot that attracted me to it. And I kept running up against, this wasn't the only moral problem I had with it, but this was kind of a big one. I would say it mostly came from an intuition standpoint, but I was willing to concede, okay, maybe my intuitions are just wrong. But it seemed like a lot of these arguments of people gaining value either by matter of degree or by what they can do. So are people, that's really it, right? Are people valuable by what they can do or valuable by what they are? And I guess part of the problem was and sometimes it was just completely arbitrary. Okay, do people have value because they're self-conscious or because they can feel pain or because they can reason or because they can recognize their parents? It just like constantly shifts around was one of the, and there just seemed to be no principled way of saying this is aside from just by being included in the human species, by just being essentially a person, an actual human life that is actually a human with certain potentialities that haven't been actualized yet. And that's where actually Thomas Aquinas was, I thought, really helpful in trying to understand this. That might be more technical detail than we care to go into for this episode. But I'm like, okay, if we want to affirm that humans have value by what they are rather than what they do, which seems to be the only way to prevent the things that we all find pretty repugnant, such as discrimination, then it's hard to find how else they would have value apart from just being included in the human species right at conception. So that's kind of the line that we're kind of dancing around right now, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, keep in mind that's exactly right. All that's right. You mentioned though. There actually so the pro-life argument comes down to abortion is the intentional killing of an unborn or a preborn human being. The intentional killing of a preborn human being is impermissible. Therefore, abortion is impermissible. Okay. Now, there are two ways to attack that argument. So we've already discussed the personhood, right? So the idea is that, well, what is being killed is not a person, and so therefore it doesn't follow that it is killing something of value. Okay. The other route, and you touched on this in your previous comment, the other route is to grant that you and I come into existence at conception or sometime after twinning is possible. Mm-hmm. Other approaches will grant that you and I exist from early on in prenatal development, but that we're not harmed. And the notion of harm here is interesting. The notion of harm requires the ability to take an interest in continued living. So there are actually two approaches here with a pro-choice position, right? Now, the latter approach, the approach that focuses on the conditions under which can be harmed, mm-hmm. We can talk a little bit about that, but that there are, I find that there are problems here. Namely, well, we've already mentioned them. Counterexamples from the case of a mother who abuses drugs, right? Yeah. Our intuition is that the child was harmed by the drug addiction at the time she was taking drugs. So, even though the preborn child can't take an interest at that time in his or her development, she or he is still being harmed and wronged by the drug abuse. Yes. So that seems to be a clear counterexample to that line of thought. So the more plausible approach is to focus on this idea of personhood, mm-hmm. and there is an intuitive attraction to it. I've already mentioned some the distinction between functioning as a person and being a person, but the principal problem with the personhood approach. And here I have to get a little bit technical. Hopefully your listeners will follow this out. But right, yeah, so please do. Yep. Mm-hmm. So let me just try it. Let's get it out there, right? And hold on, real quick, Stephen, before you can, would you mind making this a two-parter with me? Just because I know there's so much to unpack here, and I don't want to rush through any of this, but I have another call that I have to hop on in a few minutes. So. Absolutely, that's fine. We could end here and then maybe pick up where. I think that's perfect. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, because this is such an important discussion. I don't want to have to like cram any of it in. But yeah, let's develop this point and then we can pick it up here in the next one. Right. So on the personhood objection, right? The personhood objection to the pro-life view will say that you and I do not come into existence until there's an exercisable capacity for consciousness, sentience, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. So let's say 22 weeks, right? 22 weeks. You have a human being who's cruising along up until 22 weeks. And then a capacity for consciousness comes on, and now you and I come into existence. The person comes into existence. What happens to that human being? Well, it seems like that human being continues to exist too. That human being doesn't go out of existence. That bodily development, that embryoid body, that fetal body, whatever, that continues to exist. It doesn't go out of existence.
Yeah, right? It's not like it's replaced in existence, right?
Yeah. So you now have two things. You have the person and the human organism. Okay? Well, now, when you, the person, thinks, insofar as we think as a function of a functional brain, a sensory body, etc., well, it looks like the human being thinks too. After all, the human being has every right to say that that's my brain too. That's my central nervous system too. But if they're different things, if human being and person are different things, and the human being thinks your thoughts and you think your thoughts, you now have two thinkers where there should only be one.
And that's beyond weird.
Well, so again, if you split up, right? Again, this is the problem with dualism, right?
I was going to say it's beyond Gnosticism. Where we're going, it's incoherent.
Yeah. So it entails. So if you commit to the idea that human being is not the same thing as a person, but the human being thinks all of your thoughts because it has your brain, your central nervous system. You now have two different things who have the exact same psychological properties. You now have two thinkers where there should only be one. This is called the two thinkers problem for any view, any psychological account of personhood.
Yeah, and that's funny because I haven't heard that one on CNN. I wonder, did they forget your phone number when you were like trying to find somebody to argue the pro-life side? I've never heard. Just maybe I just missed that episode. I think
I did too. So that seems to be the principal problem. It entails this very counterintuitive result, and the only really way to resolve this is to agree that you and I are rational animals. Yeah. And that the psychological abilities are abilities of you. So we aren't identical to a psychological capacity, but we have them.
Yes.
Right. And so that leaves the possibility that you and I can pre-exist.
So they're powers that flow from our essence, right?
That's exactly right.
Yep.
Yes.
Wow. I think that is a perfect place to hit pause, and I think we can develop that further on the next one, because I think there's also a great assumption that, unfortunately, or I think fortunately, because I think it's worth probing, is why do humans have value to begin with, and where does that value come from? So,
okay, very good,
yeah. So can we put that on the table next time? I'm loving this conversation, and I think it's worth diving deeper into.
Yeah, very good. We'll pick up there next time.
Great. Okay, everybody, welcome back. We are joined again by Dr. Steve. Now, let me know if I pronounce this right. Napier?
Napier. Yep.
Napier. Okay, like Jack Napier from the original 1989 Batman. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, good, very good. And we've been wading through what is obviously a very hot political and controversial topic, and we're trying to really think our way through this issue and trying to gain as much clarity on it as we can. The abortion debate is something that people have requested that I discuss on the podcast. So part of the reason I'm doing this with Steve here is he is a professional bioethicist, philosopher. So his job is literally to spend his career thinking about these issues and trying to sort this matter out. So this is part 2, and I don't know if this will be conjoined to part 1, so you'll just have, if that's the case, you'll have noticed a sort of weird interruption there. That's all right. You get what you pay for with the Pat Flynn Show. Or maybe it's separate. We'll figure that out. But I figure either way, it might be helpful to just kind of start with a summary of what we've discussed so far, which I know it's only been like 3 days since we last chatted, Steve. So, could you could you help refresh my demented brain?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, I think we reviewed a little bit the arguments or the argument against the permissibility of abortion, and there were basically two routes to rebut that argument. One was to focus, basically, one was to focus to grant that you and I are human beings from the moment of conception or somewhere thereabouts onward, but that we don't have the requisite moral status at that time in our development.
Mm-hmm.
And the other route was to say that you and I don't come into existence until after a big majority of abortions typically take place.
Mm-hmm.
So the first route, to cash that out a little bit more, made reference to typically how that is argued is that you and I don't have moral status at that time because we can't take an interest in continued living.
Mm-hmm.
And we can only be harmed if our interests are frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
And so that talked a little bit about why that route is not plausible. One of the reasons why it's not plausible is it would permit infanticide.
Yeah.
And other, I mean, even toddlercide maybe, because toddlers might not be able to conceive of a future where their self exists into the future.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the more plausible route, and the one taken by most academics and most people who would take this position, is to deny that you and I are persons when the typical abortions take place, namely around 12 weeks. I think 80% of all abortions take place prior to 12 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we ended the last session with what I refer to as probably the third and more fundamental philosophical criticism. And it's called the two thinkers problem. And maybe we could start by briefly summarizing it.
Yeah, let's recap that, because I think it is a really interesting argument, and I think it has implications not just for the abortion the abortion debate. Sorry, I haven't really had all my morning coffee yet. I'll catch up here, Steve. I promise.
Sure.
We'll let you do most of the talking on this.
That's right. I haven't had my tea either. But.
For the best, anyways. So it's not only, I think, has implications for the abortion debate, but I think it has implications for any sort of Cartesian dualism as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it does. It does invite problems in any sort of dualism.
Mm-hmm.
It invites problems regarding this. But basically, the two thinkers problem can be understood as follows. All right, so let's start with the claim that you come into existence at, say, the 22-week point of gestation, when the capacity for consciousness becomes immediately exercisable or immediately active, or the capacity for sentience, or whatever it might be, some psychological property or a psychological capacity, maybe a better term to use there.
Sure.
So what happens to the human being when the person comes on the scene? Well, the human being doesn't die. I mean, the human being was that bodily being, that organism that continues to exist, right? The heart, the lungs, the arms, legs, all that seems to be there, and there's this continuous development. So now it looks like there are two things, the person and the human being. And they're in the same spot, right? We can try to connect the dots here and see what the problem here really comes down to this. When your human being, when you think, when the person thinks, there's a very plausible assumption that your human being thinks as well. Why? Because when you think in virtue of your brain, your central nervous system, right? Well, it seems like the human being can easily also claim, or your human being can easily also claim that, hey, that's my brain too, and that's my central nervous system too.
Yep.
Right? So the way one philosopher puts it is, I'm going to mispronounce his name, but Arnadatur. He says, wherever there is a thinking person, there is a thinking animal distinct from it, then there are at least twice as many thinkers as we thought there were. Right? So anytime you think your thoughts, your human being also thinks those very thoughts too, because you think your thoughts in virtue of having the same central nervous system, the same cognitive capacities, the same brain, et cetera, et cetera. And that is counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to say that there are two thinkers when we thought there should only be one.
Mm-hmm.
And the error seems to be easily remedied, right? It's to refuse to say that a new thing comes into a being just simply because your human being develops a capacity.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Right. So it seems more sensible to say that your human being, you, developed a capacity for consciousness. And this also this gets back to the first point I raised in the last podcast. Schwarz and Taselli point out that the psychological account that we're critiquing here fails to distinguish between being a person and functioning as one.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing we have to make clear, maybe another point in this regard, is that the development of the human being is compatible with the identity of that human being through its development.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The development of a human being does not change its identity. And so when the capacity for consciousness comes on the scene, that's the human being developing that capacity.
Which all of this really is just a sort of technical exploration of a position that is inherently common sense to almost everybody, right?
Yeah.
When my mom says that she was pregnant, she always says that she was pregnant with me, not the human body that I later came to inhabit.
Yeah, and on that point too, there's an interesting language thing. When we actually, it's maybe a more tangential, but I do think it's important to raise. I mean, when the discussion on abortion takes place, typically the term fetus is used, mm-hmm. Right? But when we are talking about pregnant women who, mothers who want their child, we talk about the baby. When we approach, when my wife was pregnant with my daughter, people asked, "How's your baby doing?"
Mm-hmm.
They don't ask, "How's your fetus doing?"
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this there's this shift of language that interestingly takes place once we have an interest in arguing for one side or the other. I think that the common sense intuition, when you take interest out of it, is to say that you and I came into existence and that our mothers were pregnant with us,
mm-hmm.
you and me, right? And that seems to be seems to be more intuitive.
And if it would be immoral to kill me now, and that was still me at this point when I was in my mother's womb, it would be immoral to have killed me then.
That's exactly right, and that's why I think the pro-life position is more compatible with our commitment to equality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I do want to explore this a little bit more. I know it's life in academia must be really interesting because it's just like you hear and it's like, okay, this is kind of a really bizarre position and somebody's positing it. But now as a philosopher, I have to respond to it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's better than some of the memes you get on the internet, but it's just like it fascinates me as somebody who is formally outside the academy but has many friends within just and who tries to keep up on the literature, just seeing some of these arguments but there's also just really weird implications that would fall out of that type of the position we're arguing against, or any other type of dualism in general, where you say that if you are not your body, right, let's even just take that position, then I don't think people would want to follow through on some of the other ethical consequences of that, because then it would be like rape then would be a property crime, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And actually, that's exactly what some philosophers have used, that very term. Rape becomes a property crime, and that we don't take it as such. That's it's a crime against the person.
It's a crime against me or somebody else. Or if I kiss my wife, I'm not really kissing my wife. I'm kissing her piece of property. Right?
Yeah, right.
Or if I'm just my brain, right? So maybe they just try and just put it as like you're just your brain. then the only time, I forget who and it said this argument originally, then the only time my wife would kiss me is during cranial surgery.
Yeah. Who is that? That's right. Somebody said that. I forget who said that, but very.
Alexander Pruss. That's who.
Pruss. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was Pruss, and he's got some nice developments here. So it just, even if you just try to accept these positions to, I guess, make the moral case for abortion, I think that the implications that fall out of them, if you follow it through, are just obviously so strange and ultimately unacceptable. In a sense, the same thing. If I'm not my body, and rape is a property crime, then, would the government have some moral claim to take one of my kidneys then, in the same way that it can take some of my money, right?
Yeah, and it also it can possibly work at cross purposes with other arguments for abortion, namely bodily rights, right? I mean, if bodily rights are important, they're important because they're mine.
Yeah, it's part of me.
Yeah, and so the psychological account has some tension. I haven't really thought too much about it, but it's definitely in tension with other arguments for the permissibility of abortion, namely bodily rights.
Yeah, so it has some practical, possibly self-undermining consequences for its own position, but even more fundamentally that, it just seems to be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to be wrong. I mean, but again, I mean, we mentioned the intuition. Again, why is it attractive? I do think it's important to understand why it's attractive, so we understand why people might be led astray in terms of, of why. Well, let me back up. Why would it be attractive? It's because when we list the important properties about ourselves, well, thinking would be one of them, right? But of course, I'm not identical to a thought.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not identical to a conscious state. I'm not identical to even a capacity for consciousness.
Because if somebody would say that you're identical to a thought or even a thought process rather than you thinking, then we would say something like, well, if you had different thought processes 10 years ago or even 5 minutes ago, you wouldn't be the same person. And that just seems really weird. Yeah.
So it's when you back it up, say, hey, well, it's the capacity for thinking or consciousness. But I'm not a capacity. I have capacities, but I'm not identical to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when we think about it, I prefer to think about it developmentally. And one thing that got me into this issue was I attended a lecture by Father Tad Polchik, and he was giving a lecture on embryonic stem cell research. And towards the end of his talk, he gave this thought experiment. He said, back in the days when the bald eagle was a protected species, was an endangered species, it was illegal to hunt a bald eagle. It was illegal to shoot a bald eagle. But it was also illegal to destroy the eggs. If one came across a nest of a bald eagle, it was illegal to destroy those eggs.
Mm.
And sensibly enough, because you're destroying a member of the bald eagle family. You are compromising the existence of the bald eagles.
Mm-hmm.
And that thought experiment really kind of clicked for me. It might not click for everyone, but it made me think, yeah, the development of an entity does not change the identity of that entity. Right? It's still the same thing. It is a bald eagle that is at an immature stage of development. And I think we should say the same thing about human beings, even though human beings can't think at a particular stage in our development. Well, neither can a bald eagle fly when it's in an egg. But that doesn't mean that it's not a bald eagle. It also doesn't mean that one shouldn't kill it.
Yes.
So the endangered species thing also imports our intuitions on value, right? It's this thing is an irreplaceable. If I were to kill this particular bald eagle, this egg, that is irreplaceable.
Mm-hmm.
I can't go back on that. And that also, I think, can be migrated. That thought can migrate over into the abortion issue, and we can understand how each human being, even at a particular developmental stage, no matter what the developmental stage, is it still an irreplaceable human being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'll just make a further note that was a nice use of the word migration in terms of birds, and then
right.
Yeah. See, I caught that. I wasn't sure. You got to have some laughs in an otherwise tough conversation, right?
Yeah, right. That's right.
So okay. I think this is really good stuff in trying to make sense of the sort of personhood debate. Is there any other points that we want to talk about on from this angle or this perspective that you think are worth considering, or should we move on to some other objections and contentions?
Yeah, I don't have too much to say more on the personhood aspects. I mean, I could probably forward on to you some articles that you could maybe upload to your website.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll try to find something that's in the public domain and won't be violating any copyright or anything like that. But that's all I have to say off the top of my head.
Great. No. I think that's really good and helpful in seeing that. Well, I would actually be curious now because on even because this is our first time chatting, so I'm not even kind of sure exactly what your sort of metaphysical assumptions are. You take a sort of Aristotelian Thomistic view of the soul and rational animals, or what's just your what do you think is the best sort of metaphysical foundation to be working from in this type of discussion?
Yeah, I do side with the Aristotelian tradition on this. I do think that it's very plausible to say that you and I are human beings. The intuition that Aristotle was functioning with. Keep in mind that he has a whole corpus devoted to biology. And actually, when I first learned Aristotle, we read his biological works before we read his stuff on metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a 1-to-1 match. You could tell he was thinking about, he was looking at the world, and he saw these different kinds, and these kinds explained the capacities and powers that these different kinds of things had.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think it is the most empirically supported view. I do think it's compatible with evolutionary theory. There's some articles on that.
Yep.
So yeah, I do think it's a plausible tradition, and it best accounts for our experience.
Very cool. Okay, that was just from my own personal curiosity, so we can move on from that. So why don't we real quick just kind of summarize the original, call it master argument or syllogism that you put out for the pro-life position, and then we can kind of maybe look at some of the other common objections.
Yeah, so the summary, abortion is the intentional killing of preborn human beings. There's no moral difference between preborn and postborn human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it's impermissible to kill pre-human beings.
Okay, very good. So we've been sort of defending that second premise. Now, I guess it's probably worth spending some time on the first one of saying that abortion is the intentional killing. I know some people will say, well, no, it's just the ending of a pregnancy. So what would be your general response to something like that?
Yeah, good. So it's interesting when I think Melissa Oden, and there's a website devoted to those who have survived abortions. And it's interesting, Melissa Oden, she'll say that in her medical record, in her mother's medical record, Melissa Oden survived an abortion. And in her mother's medical record, I think it's documented failed abortion or unsuccessful abortion. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So when the child survives, the abortion is considered a failure.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the death of the preborn child is considered the end of the abortion procedure.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about it's ending the pregnancy, well, there are a number of ways a pregnancy can end, namely birth.
Yes, or a C-section.
Or a C-section, right? There are any number of ways where pregnancies can end where there's no moral, it's not morally charged in any way. Mm-hmm. It's how is it ended, right? And what is the target or the reason why it's being ended? And I think with most abortion procedures, DNCs, DNEs, even the abortion pill, the object is, or the goal is, to end the life of the preborn child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good point of clarification, and it's just something that commonly comes up. So I thought it was worth at least spending and I don't think we need to spend any more time on that because it's just so obvious to me. But I want to be thorough here.
Sure.
So, all right, let's turn to some of the so-called hard cases, because this is where I think a lot of the debate winds up, at least on the popular level. And it typically comes down to lines, well, like, what about rape or what about incest? So how do we begin to navigate this?
Yeah. So I think Scott Klusendorf has a good line on this. So, one thing to be delicate here is that there's two different concerns in that question. One is, all right, so what's the philosophical justification here in these hard cases? Can the pro-life argument, is it strong enough to say that the preborn child, even in these tough cases, should not be killed?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's one concern. Another concern is, what would you say to a woman who got pregnant as a result of rape?
Yeah.
And to the latter, I don't know if I'd say anything. I mean, I was a crisis counselor for a rape crisis center for about a year, and I think that I would listen first,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one of the things that we were taught to do is to empower women to make good choices, and I would try to empower the woman to make a choice that she wouldn't regret later on.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of a general approach, I would say. Now, if we're just talking about the philosophical aspect of it, so Sarah,
and I think that's worth spending another, like, hanging a lantern on, is that a lot of issues, especially a lot of modern political issues, there's the philosophical or intellectual side, and then there's the emotional side, and they often get very tangled up, and both are obviously very important, but at some point we have to be able to sort of bracket at one of them and be able to talk about each of these issues independently. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, I do think it's fair, because, I mean, I cover this issue in class, and I had a student one time say, so would you force a rape victim to carry a pregnancy to term? That's how she phrased it. And if you phrase it that way, then it looks like you're taking the power away from the rape victim again.
Mm-hmm.
And I would rather view it as, no, it's not the way to think about it. I think the way to think about it is to love the rape victim and to
Mm-hmm.
empower the rape victim to make a choice she won't regret.
Mm-hmm.
And that they're solving the rape through another violent act. I mean, let's face it, the abortion does intend to destroy a preborn human being. And that is, if that's not a violent act, I don't know what is. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how performing another violent act is going to be therapeutic.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I do think that there has to be this separation here. Otherwise, you do get these claims, well, you're just out to force rape victims to do what they don't want to do. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the proper way to understand the argument. I think we need to understand it a little bit more broadly.
Mm-hmm. And also, at least at this point, we are really just considering, what is the morality of the situation. We haven't touched what should the legality of it be either.
No, that's right.
And these are two separate issues in and of themselves.
That's right. There are a couple of different issues going on.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, when I just mentioned to think about it more broadly, I mean, you want to think about these hard cases like rape and incest. We have to attend to what is being presumed.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this is what we're asked to imagine. We're asked to imagine basically this woman for whom every single man in her life is a jerk.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I don't see that as pro-woman. I don't see that as advancing the love that all women deserve, right? And so the idea of just assuming that there's this woman who's completely alone, and all the men in her life are jerks. I think the pro-life response should be, men, get with it. Stop objectifying women. Stop trying to perform violent acts against women.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's perfectly consistent with the pro-life position to say stop rape and stop abortion.
Yeah, why does it have to be an either or?
Yeah, I don't see anything preventing a pro-life person from saying that.
Yeah.
So getting back, maybe we could go back to the philosophical.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what's being purported here? Sarah Foster has this nice example. She has us entertain. Imagine you have 4 friends, right? I mean, you probably have more than that, but
you'd be surprised unless we can put you in the circle here by the end of this conversation.
Right, yeah. So let's say one friend was conceived in IVF, another friend was conceived husband and wife, another friend was conceived single mother, and another friend was conceived as a result of rape.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And you have all these friends. You have these 4 friends. Is there any difference in value between any of those friends?
Mm-hmm.
No. That would be ridiculous to say that these friends, their value is somehow a function of how they came into this world.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea here that she's trying to get at is that the circumstances of our conception doesn't affect how worthwhile we are. We're still human beings with irreplaceable value.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, I mean, if the philosophical argument that some of these hard cases want to trot out wants to say, well, abortion is permissible in these hard cases, that doesn't seem to follow, right? If they're already assuming that you and I are not human beings, not human beings at that point when an abortion would take place. If we are, then you're back to Sarah Foster's thought experiment. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Your 4 friends are human beings, right? And they are equally valuable. The circumstances of the conception do not affect their worth. And that seems to be plausible to me.
It not only seems to be plausible, it seems to be, obvious once you can frame it out of the, sort of emotionally charged circumstances that, people might be like these what if situations that you're bringing up. And I think it goes back again to this idea brought up originally, is that inherently we're really trying to argue against forms of discrimination.
That's exactly right.
At the end of the day. And yeah. I think that's something that pretty much anybody could get behind. And there's something kind of very sad about it's all very sad. Don't get me wrong. It's all very sad. Many of these circumstances, but to have the sort of, abortion argument pushed through because of these hard cases, well, the people who have been born, as the result of rape or one of these hard cases, what is that telling them? What is that signaling to them that their life somehow isn't as valuable? If they would have been killed, that would have been okay because of their manner of conception, and that just doesn't seem right to me. That does seem like a form of arbitrary discrimination. Yeah,
and excuse me, and I like to phrase it as just, this is a justice issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be, the pro-life position on this seems to be more just, right? That the preborn child shouldn't be killed because of what his or her biological father has done.
Yeah, and when is there a case where we would attempt to solve one injustice, which rape absolutely is, with further injustice? Is I think is kind of how you're saying it, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and again, I'm thinking here. No doubt these are hard cases, but I think hard cases need to be met with greater love,
mm-hmm.
right? Not And again, I really get back to, I really do think that the pro-life response should be end rape and end abortion. These hard cases assume a constant, right? They assume that there are these that immoral acts, rape and incest, would continue to occur. And I want to say, let's not settle for that. Let's not settle for that. Let's get rid of that.
Yeah, I think the pro-life position generally, when you really try to understand it, is it's looking for social change on many levels.
Absolutely,
many levels. So to kind of push the hard cases to another avenue, but I think it kind of fits in with this. Well, what if my child is going to be handicapped, disabled, diseased, deformed, any of those things, right?
Yeah, this is good. So again, get back to Scott Klusendorf. He has this interesting way of articulating it. He has what's called the toddler test.
Mm-hmm.
So let's fast forward, right? Let's say that the child is born, has Down syndrome, or the child is born and has, I don't know, whatever, cleft palate or whatever it might be, or some form of deformity. Well, you wouldn't kill the born child, right? You wouldn't kill the child who has Down syndrome and is thriving and thriving as much as he or she can.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Down syndrome children, I know several Down syndrome children. They're a bright light in the world.
Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
They can enjoy life. They love to play. They're very affectionate and caring. So this idea of I have to, if my child is not going to be or reach this ideal of perfection, then it's permissible for me to kill it. Well, we wouldn't use that argument for the born child.
Mm-hmm.
And so these arguments subtly import an unjustified premise that the preborn child is not identical to the postborn child. And I think that's when we get back to the argument.
It just takes us right back to the original argument.
Yeah. So all these quote unquote hard cases, the only reason why they're hard philosophically speaking, right? They might be hard emotionally, and how do we deal with this? But the only reason why we might find them hard philosophically speaking is because we're already importing assumptions that the fundamental pro-life argument has rebutted.
Yeah, very good. Very, very good. That's well articulated. And again, I think that just makes sense. And for anybody who is against forms of discrimination, I think should easily be able to get on board with that point of view. But let's keep going down the list here, because I think there's a lot of kind of what if objections that people make. So I mean, two more that just come off the top of my head. What if there's too many babies? What are we going to do with all these people, right? That's one. Or what if, this person's going to be born into really hard circumstances, poverty, etc. So two at you there, but kind of in the same vein.
Yeah, good. So again, so let's take the overpopulation, right? I don't know. I don't have too much sympathy with this line. You might have to get somebody else on to be more sympathetic with it. But look, people just don't get pregnant. I mean, let's leave rape cases aside. It's not as if people just happen to get pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's choices made, right? And so, to the question, what about overpopulation? Well, if we're concerned about that, then we should tailor our sexual practices in light of avoiding, that concern.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is that we don't go around. So, for example, there might be overpopulation in some parts of poor countries, and we don't go around killing those people.
Yeah, we don't go in there with a Gatling gun and be like, no. We don't know what to do with all you people. So
right.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that overpopulation or some of those concerns justify killing people.
Mm-hmm.
I think what they justify is being more responsible in terms of child rearing and et cetera. being more responsible with our choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that just seems reasonable through and through. And it seems like a lot of these, the way to kind of navigate a number of these issues is just, take the principle that you're trying to apply to support the abortion argument and just bring it into some circumstance outside the womb. Like, for example, there might be more people than what it seems a certain territory can support at some part of the world. Would it be morally permissible to literally go over there and start committing genocide because of that? And I don't think anybody would think that that's okay.
Exactly. That's right. What was the second?
The second one would be economic considerations. Well, what if this person is born into poverty or hard times, or if we perform abortions, maybe we'll have better economic outcomes for maybe women specifically, or just the country in general. So yeah, economic lines of argument, I would say.
Yeah. So I mean, this again, we can apply the slavery test to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's arguments for slavery appeal to the economic interests of plantation owners and those who controlled the economy, but clearly that's an unjust practice, right? And so economic considerations don't seem to support further injustices and against people.
And the one thing I want to make about the slavery case is the economic arguments were right. Like, when we abolished slavery, hard economic times followed. They weren't wrong, but it was still right to abolish slavery.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And keep in mind, there's something interesting in some of these objections, if you will. Notice the burdens occur after birth. Right. All of these burdens occur after birth, and Kelsey Hazard points out, look, what this does is it totally undermines the bodily rights arguments. Mm-hmm. Right, the Thompsons of the world, and et cetera, et cetera. The burdens of pregnancy are rarely ever used as a justification for abortion. It's the burdens that's going to occur after birth, mm-hmm. when you have a child, and obviously that everyone agrees is a child. And so there's some of these objections, to the extent that one might find them plausible, again, undermine some of the other arguments for the abortion position. Mm-hmm. Right? Again, there's an inconsistency, or at least a tension between some of these claims. One last point on that. Notice also what's granted. Right? If these hardships after birth, right, the economic conditions or whatever it might be, notice what's being granted. What's being granted is that if abortion is going to function as a solution to that, you must assume that the preborn child is identical to the born child. Mm-hmm. Right? Because, again, if abortion is going to be a solution to end the life of that child, a solution, scare quotes.
Yep.
Right. It's granting, the argument is granting that preborn child is that same thing that's going to be hard to take care of, or whatever. It's going to put economic pressures on the family.
And believe me, they do. That's true.
Yeah, that's true.
I got number 4 on the way. Yeah, so, this is going to be a burden. Yeah, but a burden that is worth loving, I might add.
Yeah, but notice it's granting this ontological continuity. This continuity of this, that's the same being. And so, in a way, some of these hard cases, or some of these objections having to do with burdens after birth, are granting the very premise in the pro-life argument. Mm-hmm. And so I would want to make sure that that point is recognized.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did that, because I think it's important to kind of come back to the fundamentals here and see, what is being conceded or what is being assumed. And again, the whole economics is more of my formal background. Economics is, it's prudential. Like if we decide that something is worth pursuing, economics can possibly say something about, good ways of achieving that, but it's not moral. And it seems like the only reason that we would even care about economics or economic considerations to begin with is, again, because it's attached to human affairs, and we feel that humans are valuable and therefore deserve to live a fairly decent life, right? So I think it kind of comes back to that, taking that thing of instrumental or derivative value again, and trying to put it above that which it's attached to of intrinsic value.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, That's right.
So, and again, just trying to be kind of thorough here, I do want to cover a few more things. One is again trying to let's do the what I think is a much more fair quote unquote hard case, and that is what if it's to save the life of the mother, for example. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know how deep we want to go in here and like doctrine of double effect and all this or that, but maybe you can start to give us an introduction of how we can navigate such cases as these.
Yeah, so these are legitimate hard cases. So I think we have to pay attention to what the first premise of the pro-life argument is: abortion is the intentional killing. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the intentional killing of a preborn child. So in some of these cases where, let's say, ectopic pregnancy is literally means outside of. Ectopic, right? It's outside of the uterus. And what happens is that the preborn child starts actually implants somewhere along the fallopian tube, mm-hmm. typically, and starts to grow there. And of course, the fallopian tube cannot accommodate, a full-grown not a full-grown, but a full-grown preborn child.
Yeah.
And so the risk of hemorrhaging, life-threatening hemorrhaging and rupture can occur. Mm-hmm. And so for ectopic pregnancies, it's typically been granted that one can remove the what's been implanted there. But that is analogous to a typical case to illustrate the principle of double effect. Namely, let's say a pregnant mother has uterine cancer, mm-hmm. right? And she needs the uterus removed in order to have the cancer treated. Let's also say that, assume that there are no artificial wombs developed. Right? Yeah. The typical argument is that the removal of the uterus is intending to save the life of the mother with the foreseen but not intended side effect of the preborn child dying. Mm-hmm. Right? It's no different than most other medical procedures, right? If you're on chemotherapy, you take chemotherapy with the intention of its therapeutic effects, with the foreseen but non-intended effect of, say, throwing up or losing your hair or something like that. Right? Mm-hmm. The digestive tract issues that can occur.
Yeah.
And so if we can see, and let's be fair, like most medical interventions have bad side effects. Every single drug has a side effect profile. Mm-hmm. You get a shot, it has a side effect profile. Surgery, right? Surgery has, you're cutting somebody open or whatever it might be. But no clinician is going to say that they're intending to chop off somebody's leg. Mm-hmm. What they're intending to do is they're intending to save the life of this person because, say, their foot is gangrenous.
Yes.
So I think the same type of double effect reasoning that applies to other segments of medical practice apply also to these cases where, say, ectopic pregnancy or preeclampsia or some of the other problematic cases that that can affect pregnant women.
Yeah, and that, again, the intention really matters here because, say, if artificial wombs were developed or we had the technology that we could save the baby, we would obviously want to do that.
That's exactly right, yeah. More problematic cases, for which I don't have an opinion, but cases where it's not the pregnancy itself that's causing the problem, but it's the pregnancy paired with something about the mother's health status. So, for example, hypertension, pulmonary hypertension. Right? There's this famous case down in Phoenix, Arizona, at a hospital, St. Joseph Hospital down there, where the mother had pulmonary hypertension, and she got pregnant consensually. She was in a married relationship. Now she knew she had pulmonary hypertension, and she was counseled not to get pregnant. But she got pregnant, and one of the things about pregnancy is your blood volume goes up as the pregnancy develops. And I think it was about 11 weeks gestation or something like that, but it was definitely before viability. Her pulmonary hypertension was in full swing, and she was in danger of dying. And because of the incipient stage of gestation and the seriousness of her pulmonary hypertension, she was not a candidate for C-section. Apparently, the only medical way to save her life was to remove the placenta. But at that stage in development, you can't just pick out the placenta without picking out the preborn child as well. And so I believe the DNC was done. So that is a particular hard case. Luckily, they don't happen a lot, but I would say that, there's different pro-life authors who take different positions on this. Some think that was impermissible. It was still a direct attack on the preborn child and should not have been done. Others say that, even with the high risk of and the known effect of killing the child, one could still try to intend a placentectomy, right? Really try to intend a microsurgery of removing the placenta without trying to directly harm the unborn child. And if somebody did have that intention, that of course would not be an intention to destroy the child. It would be an intention to take away what's causing the placenta is what causes the increase in blood volume. So it'd be taking away the cause of the mortal pulmonary hypertension.
So I think a couple big points that I want to draw out of these hard cases is to acknowledge that the pro-life position isn't just for the baby; it's for the mom too. It's for everybody. It would be one point. Two is that it's not like pro-life people don't consider and think deeply about how to best handle these hard cases. Three would be these hard cases are very unfortunate and rare, and we shouldn't use these hard exceptions to inform the rule. And I guess number four would be that, maybe, hopefully, fortunately, and probably someday technology might be able to solve these issues for us. So I don't know if you have any comments on any of those points.
Other than that, they're all right on. Yes.
All right. Trying to score points with the professor here.
Yeah, no, I do think the pro-life view is a pro-love view. And the idea is to love everyone. And again, like I said in the last podcast, I think I quoted Groucho Marx, he would never be a member of a club that would accept them. Likewise, for moral standards or moral ideals, I do think the pro-life view really challenges all of us to get out of ourselves, right? And to strive for a higher level of love for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's always what's been extremely attractive about the pro-life position, at least to me. Again, long before I was religious, like I said, I first struggled with this as a high schooler trying to make sense of libertarian philosophy again, and how this didn't seem to, and those pro-choice arguments from libertarian philosophers, just there's something that didn't sit right with me on the level of just moral intuition there. And I was willing to say, okay, well, maybe my intuition I think intuition can be generally reliable, but it's certainly not infallible. So maybe And it got me thinking, deeply about these issues. Even from, at the time, I would say a completely secular viewpoint. So I just trying to show that this is a position that can be, and I think should be supported no matter what anybody's political or religious commitments are. But there's two more things I want to talk with you about, Dr. Steve. One, I guess, is kind of like a probabilistic. I'm not exactly sure how to formulate this. Maybe you've thought about this before and can help me develop it a little bit on the fly here. And then the other is how the pro-life position actually can be, and I think both of us would argue, is pro-woman. But the first one would be something like this, is that, okay, maybe somebody's listening to this and they're hearing the arguments and maybe they're not entirely sold, but they could at least concede, okay, this seems this seems reasonable. Definitely a rational person could hold to this view. It seems like there's an argument that can be made here and there's plausibility to it. Well, then, I don't know, like call it like a pseudo Pascal's wager on abortion. It seems like something like we might be able to say something like this. Like, if there is, a reasonable case to be made that abortion really is the direct killing of an innocent human life, and if we want to apply the term murder there, whatever, maybe we could, maybe it's better not to for just purposes of ecumenical conversation. But if there's a reasonable case to be made that this really is an immoral act and possibly a gravely immoral act, then it's possible and even quite plausible that certain countries, including America, may be contributing to one of the greatest holocausts that humanity has ever known. And if that's even, I don't know what percentage we would need there, but if that even seems to have any plausibility at all, I think we should be deeply concerned about that. You see the kind of angle I'm trying to take here?
Yeah. So the cost in being wrong that for lack of a better term, the pro-choice position is right. The cost in being wrong that it's correct does have drastic consequences to it. We end up killing people who ought not to be killed.
Thank you for making that concise. That's why you're a professional.
So the cost in being wrong that the pro-life view is correct, no one gets killed.
Yeah.
The cost in being wrong about that, no one gets killed in that cost. Right. So I do think that when you add up is what you're trying to do, and when you add up the cost or the risk in being wrong, the risk in being wrong is wholly on the side of being wrong about the pro-choice position.
That's a really good way of putting that. Thank you. So it's just, if you're kind of on the fence then, right, and maybe you're going to keep seeking this issue out and trying to learn about it, but if you're on the fence and you're not sure where to fall, then that's something that should be considered, you would say.
Yeah, it's something needs to be considered.
Yeah. What is the cost if you're wrong? Yeah. Very good. Okay, last point, unless there's any other things that you think are worth discussing, is help us understand how the pro-life position can be or possibly very much is pro-woman.
Yeah, so there's a lot to say on this. The Feminists for Life. There's actually 3 organizations devoted to life feminism. I think it's New Wave Feminists, Feminists for Life, and Feminists for Nonviolent Choices. There might be others. But when we think about what's going on, we should not have a society that encourages or makes it such that a woman has to choose between her child and a career, her child and education. To pit her own child against her own interests is a sign that something's gone wrong. Right? And so abortion enables continued injustices where women are still not free to make decisions that are more comprehensive in terms of what they would be, they can, or not they would be, but they can be interested in. And there's a nice line in one of the documents that Sarah Foster puts out. Without housing on campus, without on-site daycare, without maternity coverage in one's health insurance plan, it doesn't look like, say, college students really have a choice, right? And so this talk about choice, I would say that that's why I said, for lack of a better term, pro-choice view, that there really isn't, right? 67% of those receiving abortions report being pressured into it. Maybe not forced into it, but pressured into it. And that, again, that doesn't seem to be the approach. We should care for and love everyone as much as possible, and it doesn't look like abortion does that. Last point on this might be a little bit more controversial, but it shows up in some feminist literature. I was reading Catherine McKinnon, who wrote a book, The Feminist Theory of the State, and she quotes Andrea Dworkin at one point, and I'm paraphrasing. Andrea Dworkin says, "What was at stake in Roe v. Wade was that men could get laid."
Yes, yeah, I'll agree with that.
And so the idea of taking away the procreative aspect of sex, when you take that away, male sexual aggression is just, you've just opened up the gates, and you've opened up the gates to objectification of women, of sexual aggression towards women. And so abortion, I wouldn't say causes that, but it certainly enables it by separating off procreation from the sexual pleasure.
Yeah, and that's why I think at the beginning, I think last time we talked about how the whole culture right now, and especially this abortion debate, really in many ways can be seen as a symptom of many deeper underlying issues. And sexual ethics, I think, is certainly one of them. When we start to separate the unitive and procreative act of sex, I mean, let's be quite frank, that has, especially monogamous relationships, has a tempering and I would argue civilizing effect on men. It does.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've lost that. And like, you want to talk about things like toxic masculinity. I'll agree. Yeah. There are nasty men out there for sure. But I think part of that, if not a large degree of that, comes from exactly the things that you've just described.
No, I think that's right. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's, in that the pro-life position seems to be more comprehensively committed to women's interests. And it also sends a message to men to be more responsible and stop objectifying women. There's, I think that there's two messages here that are coming out of the pro-life view that I think need to be attended to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's I think a really good and important note, and I just want to keep emphasizing because it's just such a common misunderstanding. And I had this misunderstanding myself for a while before I really started to give an honest and serious look at the pro-life view that it only cares about ending abortion, or it only cares about the life of the baby. And you're saying that is a very limited, narrow, and incorrect understanding of the pro-life position.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stereotype, and stereotypes grow when you don't have diversity of viewpoints. And so what's happened is that, at least in some segments of society, no pro-choice person is really talking to a pro-life person.
Yeah.
This is certainly the case in academia at large. And there are some studies out there that quote-unquote anti-abortionists are the least liked by those who have a particular political identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. Continue. Yeah.
So these stereotypes have formed without any resistance, and so it's stuff like what you're doing, stuff like what all these pro-life organizations are doing, and in particular, I would say it's stuff that pro-life professors in the academy can work against and correct some of these gratuitous stereotypes and really cash out the pro-life view as a pro-love view. And it is. It always has been. Yeah, that's what I say.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. So perhaps we can, because I know there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who agree, a lot of people who are kind of on the fence, and a lot of people who would come in with strong disagreement. So I guess I would say that I hope that you have found this conversation at the very least charitable and fair, even though it's obvious what side Dr. Steve and I are coming from. But perhaps we could finish off with, for people who maybe aren't in the academy aren't reading the technical literature on this, do you have any just general resources or kind of popular level books or places that you would have people go to really start kind of looking into this or considering or getting a better understanding of the pro-life position?
Yeah, so there's a couple things out there. I do think that Stephanie Gray mentioned her work in the previous podcast. Stephanie Gray's book, Love Unleashes Life.
I'm going to put a note down on here so I can make sure I list these in the show notes. So Love Unleashes Life.
Yeah, Love Unleashes Life. I think Scott Klusendorf's The Case for Life is a very readable articulation of the pro-life view. And I think, some websites out there, there's pro-life feminists have a document. What's the title here? Pro-Woman Answers to Pro-Choice Questions. It's a very nice, that's put out by the Feminists for Life of America. Again, Pro-Woman Answers to Pro-Choice Questions.
Great.
That seems to be a very readable and succinct document that addresses probably what a broad swath of concerns. And I think it does an admirable job, and it's very readable.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Steve. This has been a really enriching conversation for me, and I hope helpful to everybody else listening in as well. So can't thank you enough for your time, and would love to have you back on to explore any number of other topics and issues if you're willing.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Pat. Definitely, bring me back on for anything whatsoever.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.